This week we heard from embittered former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who testified at the Senate inquiry into media diversity. Turnbull took advantage of parliamentary privilege to vent his concerns, primarily with this company, News Corp. But instead of taking the opportunity to discuss genuine solutions to legitimate issues in Australian media, his testimony quickly descended into rambling conspiracy theories. It was disappointing, but all too predictable behaviour, and it is important that we go through some of his comments to demonstrate just how deranged and detached from reality his arguments have become. A few minutes into the session, Turnbull alleged that he had only been barred from the head of a New South Wales climate change body because News Corp journalists had threatened Environment Minister Matt Kean. He even compared the threats to acts of torture used by corrupt police.
But the saddest thing of it all was the way Matt Kean, the minister, a good man, very committed to taking action, had to then go to the Daily Telegraph and be quoted in it saying, "Oh, News Corp had nothing to do with this decision." This is like somebody who's taken down to the police station, beaten over the head until they finally sign a fake confession.
Turnbull is ignoring the fact that pressure came from within Matt Kean's own government, including as high up as Deputy Premier John Barilaro, who told 2GB's Ray Hadley that Turnbull's recent comments on coal made him too controversial for the crucial posting.
For someone to be appointed in a government role and not to understand the passion and the policy position of the government, then in itself shows that they are thick-headed and they aren't interested in what is right and good for the economy. And that's why, you're right, you told me so. It didn't take 6 months. It took 48 hours. I'm embarrassed to say it. And I wish I spoken up. I got it wrong. But I can give you a story right now, breaking for you, Ray, is that this morning, just now, Matt Kean has agreed that he won't proceed with the appointment of Malcolm Turnbull as chair. He's rescinding that appointment, and that statement is going out as we finish the show.
It was a legitimate news story covered by Nine's 2GB, the Sydney Morning Herald and even the ABC. But instead of choosing to self-reflect on the criticisms from politicians within his own side of government, Turnbull tried to blame his demise on News Corp, despite the fact that every major news organisation was running with the story and it was even broken on 2GB. And then to top it off, Turnbull makes a baseless and frankly bizarre claim that Matt Kean's backflip was akin to a forced confession obtained through bashing someone over the head at a police station. He's just accused journalists of doing something similar to torture. Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who chairs the inquiry, did not ask him to substantiate his claims and instead allowed Turnbull to air his crazed conspiracy theory unchallenged. Was any of it true? Well, according to Matt Kean himself in this candid interview, the backlash from Barilaro's comments and other political commentary behind closed doors made Turnbull's role untenable.
Were you bullied by the News Corp media to back down over this decision?
No, not at all. I mean, it was clear that there is very strong opinions about Malcolm Turnbull, and in an area that is contested as this one, we need people that will bring the whole community along on this journey. And what was clear is that Malcolm Turnbull, love him or loathe him, was divisive when it came to these issues.
Turnbull then pivoted from his own personal employment issues and went on another bizarre rant about how this time News Corp acted like the murderous Vladimir Putin dictatorship.
What does Vladimir Putin want to do with his operations in America? He wants to divide America and turn Americans against each other, and he wants to undermine faith in their democratic institutions. That's his agenda. That's absolutely established in the intelligence community. That's what he's been seeking to do. That is exactly what Murdoch has done.
What on earth was he thinking? That's an odd comparison to make, considering Putin has murdered at least 21 journalists that we know of. These don't seem like the musings of a rational and objective witness. Turnbull made the comparison after referencing the Capitol riots as evidence. But on this point, he ignored the indisputable fact that the insurrectionists responsible for the Capitol riots were no fans of Fox News. After Fox News called Arizona for Biden, before most other news organisations, the die-hard Trump fans were enraged. Here is footage of armed supporters chanting "Fox News sucks" at a heated rally in Arizona.
You'll start here and then start up here. And they're actually chanting Fox News sucks.
News Corp's coverage in the lead up to the insurrection was calling for Trump to concede. But Turnbull didn't stop making false claims there. He continued the inquiry by going on to say that journalists at this company were doing the work of terrorists.
Because everything I was doing was obviously designed to reinforce our success as a multicultural society. And what is so frustrating is that these voices on the populist right, particularly from Murdoch's organisation, are essentially doing the work of the terrorists.
Great, so now we are effectively terrorists, or at the very least working for terrorists. So instead of discussing in detail media diversity, Turnbull used parliamentary privilege to make baseless and false allegations. And the media just lapped it up. Take a note of some of the headlines in the Sydney Morning Herald, Crikey, The Guardian, and The New Daily, which, the worst of all, repeated the terrorist slur. There are indeed issues which should be explored, and Sarah Hanson-Young unintentionally touched on one during this leading question to Malcolm Turnbull.
That then gets picked up by morning radio, morning television, and before you know it, the evening news that day is all about whether you're going to be sacked. And is that a fair assessment, that these newspapers run the agenda for everybody else?
I think the papers still set the agenda.
So newspaper journalists spend all day grinding for stories, only to have their news lines ripped out of the paper and used by ABC Radio, commercial television, and any organisation too lazy to produce any unique content. And that's supposed to be a strike against newspaper journalists? As a former newspaper journalist, I can tell you that it was at times frustrating seeing your story picked up without proper attribution by TV and radio journalists and churned out to their audiences for profit. But I fail to see how that is something that News Corp should or even could change. The problem here lies with lazy reporters at the ABC, who are simply repackaging content from hard-working print journalists in the private sector. Often these stories are sitting behind a paywall on News Corp websites, which the ABC writes a new version of and spits it into the social media atmosphere for free. Newspapers can only set the agenda if ABC journalists are not breaking any stories. There is no commercial benefit to another company stealing your work. Perhaps the ABC should be asked to explain how it fails to set the agenda with such an enormous taxpayer budget. Media diversity could be improved if journalists stopped pontificating on Twitter and started breaking stories. But this Senate inquiry will never solve that problem, because it is too busy accommodating the crazed ramblings of a former Prime Minister. Well, I'm joined live now by New York Post columnist Miranda Devine and Gemma Tognini, GT Communications. How are you both?
Great, Jack.
Hi, Jack.
Great to be
really
with you.
good. Hi, Gemma.
Now, Miranda, let's start with you, because there were a couple of references there to what was going on in America in the lead up to the Capitol insurrections. But it was quite clear that all the News Corp publications were actually asking these supporters to stand down, and Turnbull was still spreading these conspiracy theories that the reverse was somewhat true.
Look, Jack, just listening to all that, it's so delusional. It's hard to believe that a former Prime Minister would be saying these things that are just so wrong, so ignorant, so ill-informed. The fact is, you know, I know what's been going on in America very well, and Malcolm Turnbull has not been here during the entire pandemic. In fact, the entire time I've been here, almost 2 years. So he doesn't know what happened in the lead up to the election, and he doesn't know what happened afterwards. And I can tell you that Fox News lost a lot of viewers who went to other, cable channels that were running with the election conspiracy stories, whereas Fox News was extremely responsible, as was the entire News Corp, about this. In fact, in December, which was, about 7 weeks after the election, the New York Post, where I work now, had a front page saying to Donald Trump, "Stop the insanity." So the idea that News Corp encouraged or had anything to do with the Capitol riots is ridiculous and a lie. And to call us terrorists and murderers and thieves, I mean, you know, take a look at your own milieu, the people in Parliament House. Maybe criticise what you know instead of criticising an organisation that you don't understand and whose criticism you obviously just couldn't hack.
And Gemma, Miranda's touched on something very important here, that the problem that I had was not so much the criticism. If criticism's fair, then fair enough. But it was the rhetoric. It was the nasty, personal, aggressive rhetoric by a man that could operate with impunity because he's protected by parliamentary privilege, so he can make these bizarre comparisons to torture. It's not fitting of someone that holds the title of former Prime Minister, is it?
Well, not only that, Jack, it's not supported by any kind of fact. And yes. You alluded to it in your editorial. The coverage of Mr Turnbull's comments to this inquiry, for the most part, lacked any kind of analysis, any testing. It was really a regurgitation rather than what kind of basis does one make such an extraordinary claim when you're talking about police brutality and likening it to, you know, a decision by a minister who was clearly under pressure to reverse a decision that was clearly unpopular. And where was the media scrutiny around the veracity of those comments? And as you said, you know, the appropriateness of them. This parliamentary inquiry is a waste of taxpayers' money. It is a sham. It is a flight of fancy. And as a taxpayer and a voter, I look at it and think, when are they going to get back to working for you and I? When are they going to get back to the business of running the country? And when is you know, sections of the media, as you alluded to, going to start scrutinising it through the appropriate filter?